Supreme Court allows Trump administration to terminate $783 million in NIH grants leaked to DEI initiatives. By a vote of 5-4, the Supreme Court on Thursday agreed to allow the National Institute of Health, the largest public funding source for biomedical research in the world, to terminate $783 million in grants linked to DEI initiatives. In a brief, unsigned order, the court granted a request from the Trump administration to pause a ruling by a federal judge in Massachusetts that required the federal government to continue making the payments. Also, by a vote of 5-4, the court left in place a different portion of the judge ruling, which had thrown out internal NIH guidance documents describing the agency's policy priorities. Justice Amy Coney Barrett provided the key vote on each issue. She joined Justice Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh in voting to allow NIH to terminate the grants, but she joined Justice Chief John Roberts and Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson in voting to leave the lower court's ruling on the guidance documents in place. She's a flip-flopper.
What it is procedurally, they left the lower court's ruling intact on an administrative matter, and on the main issue of the lawsuit, they said we're dissolving the injunction, try the case so we can see what we really have after the facts come in under somebody being on the witness stand and testifying.
Well, Jackson had sharp words for her colleagues, describing the ruling as Calvin Ball jurisprudence, a reference to the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon with a twist. Calvin Ball has only one rule. There are no fixed rules. We seem to have two. That one and this administration always wins.
She scratched too much of her brains out, scratching her wig head when she was getting confirmed. I think they should have brought in Roger E. Clifton from the Second Circuit instead of her. Would have been a much better choice.
So it says NIH ended hundreds of grants it linked to DEI-related studies in response to a series of executive orders issued by President Donald Trump after his inauguration in January. The first order, titled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing, instructed the director of the Office of Management and Budget, assisted by the Attorney General and the Director of Office of Personnel Management, to work to end discriminatory programs, including illegal DEI programs in the federal government. It was followed by two other executive orders titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government, and ending...
Okay, stop right there. Stop
Wait,
right.
let me just read this last sentence. And ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity.
Okay, what that means is spending federal money to teach classes that, okay, say you should be taught that they're discriminating against you by basically exercising First Amendment rights to have an opinion on something.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to be protected from somebody else's. In other words, the classes that can't be funded anymore are saying it's wrong for somebody to have a First Amendment opinion. So why are you teaching somebody that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
It makes sense. Like this thing about exalting weakness. What in the world is that about? See, that's essentially what we have. We exalt weakness. In other words, if somebody says something you don't like, you are not supposed to be subject to the chance exposure to that.
mm-hmm.
Like we can't say the R word because of YouTube, but
Right.
yet every major newspaper in America, CNN, ABC, MSNBC, CBS, Fox, you name it, they use the R word all the time when there's an incident. But yet somebody's sensitivity on YouTube is such that they gotta hear this. You see, in other words, teaching a class to teach people how to oppose the R word on YouTube because you may be sensitive to it. That doesn't make good sense. So, yeah, that's not supposed to be something that 50 states worth of people have to spend their money on.
Mm-hmm. He is also, it says here that Justice Department backs lawsuits seeking to end grants for Hispanic serving colleges, calling them unconstitutional. The Trump administration said it will not defend a decades old grant program for colleges with large numbers of Hispanic students that is being challenged in court, declaring the government believes the funding is unconstitutional. In a memo sent to Congress, the Justice Department said it agrees with a lawsuit attempting to strike down grants that are reserved for colleges and universities where at least a quarter of undergraduates are Hispanic. Congress created a program in 1998 after finding Latino students were attending college and graduating far lower rates than white students. The Justice Department officials argue the program provides an unconstitutional advantage based on race or ethnicity.
Okay, what that is you're colored, so therefore you get more money because you can't make it. That's what it says, but what does that say about you if you're one of the groups that's classified as colored, Hispanic? Some of the categories, subcategories under Hispanic, Black, Native American, Asian, that doesn't apply to them because they're usually at the top being the smartest, or you're an Indian, which is, interestingly enough, white people are in the middle and at the top in per capita income and education are Indians. I sent you that chart.
Yeah, I got to do research on that chart.
I find it, in other words, obviously some people of color are not inferior when it comes to economic circumstances, and others may be, but the idea that you should be able to teach that because you are of color, you are inferior, you won't make it, is kind of insulting to the particular brand of people of color. In other words, how would that work in basketball?
Well, I put it like this. I hear what you're saying, but you could replace race and ethnicity and just put underprivileged or poor.
Oh, well, yeah, but still,
because it's not race based. It
no,
doesn't fall under DEI. But let me just say this. But it is true if you are poor, opposed to someone who is upper class or rich, there is an educational advantage.
Well, yeah, that's true. Except you have to make it relevant to the educational process. One of the biggest examples that actually was something the Old South did that defeated their purposes, they refused to allow black folk to go to their colleges and universities, like Ole Miss in Mississippi or in North Carolina or whatever. So a lot of black Americans in the 20s and 30s and in the 40s got sent to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, which is as good as it gets because they weren't going to allow them to go to Ole Miss. But you have these same black folk that come from sharecropping situations, rural areas, and so forth. They make it in Harvard, Yale, Princeton, which defeats the whole argument. So it's like an interesting thing in consideration. Now, for some reason, there is this bit that black folk can't get in Harvard, Yale, Princeton, et cetera, Stanford, these kind of places, whereas 40, not 40, not 50, not 60, but 70, 80, and 90 years ago, when the racism was really hardcore, And segregation was totally legal under American law. Black folk could make it well in these institutions.
Mhm.
So it's like something's wrong with the equation. And
What happened? That's not. Oh,
favor by taking that away and saying you can make it. 1950, how many black folk were playing NFL? Very few. How many black folk were in MLB, Major League Baseball? Very few.
so,
How
but
many
here's the
were
thing,
playing
though. But it was a
basketball?
question. But here's the question: were they being discriminated against and not allowed in?
Yeah, one
It
of the
was
most
discriminatory
racist
practice.
institutions in America in 1946, 7, 8, and 1950 was the National Bar Association. It was integrated when a guy who ran track and played football at UCLA, Don Barksdale, got hired by the Lakers to be the first black in the NBA. They did a movie about the first black, but they didn't even mention him. They mentioned somebody that was the third black. Okay, the Rams hired a guy named Kenny Washington, first black in the NFL. That was 1946. The Dodgers hired Jackie Robinson, the first black in MLB in 1946. Also, two more. Don Newcomb, who was 17 years old, he was a pitcher, and they hired Roy Campanolo, who was a catcher. So the Dodgers hired three black folk in 1946. They kept Campanolo and Newcomb in the minors for several years before they moved them up and let Robinson go directly on into the in Major League Baseball. So that's when they started this process. I
Okay.
mean, they had so few black folk, I can name every one of them that played in the NFL up until 1950. Marion Motley with the Cleveland Browns. He played football. They brought in Woody Strode with the Rams. He became an actor, played a lot of black
Yeah,
parts.
we don't need to go down the
No,
sports
I mean, I
history and
just got three
memory.
more people to name. And then you got Buddy Young came in with the Detroit
Yes,
Lions.
okay,
He
so
ran track.
let's swing it back. Let's swing it back.
Okay,
Let's
I
move
am.
into
I have two
the
more because I know them, and I'm going to mention them. You have Deacon Dan Tyler, not Deacon Jones, the defensive end, but Deacon Dan Tyler with the Rams. It was along with Tank Younger with the Rams, were the first two brothers coming out of Grambling. That was 1949. So those were all the people you had playing in the NFL in 1950, and I just illustrated our few by naming all of them. So now, how many do you have? But did they have to have affirmative action for those brothers playing football or basketball, where they say, okay, these guys, if they can only maintain a 40% percentage from the floor if they're playing basketball, then they get to play in
Well, this
NBA.
decision is not from. We're talking about the Supreme Court siding with the Trump administration to terminate $783 million in NIH grants linked to
Yes.
DEI initiatives that has nothing to do with affirmative action.
No, no, well, it does. See, in other words, the grants are all saying you're inferior. You can't make it without help. That's
Well, the
essentially what
grants is just for a study. It's for
I
different
know. That's
studies.
you're studying
But,
why
but
you're
see, here's the
inferior.
thing, though. But here's the thing: what's wrong with studying different different genres or different or different
In
I don't
other words,
I don't want to say things because that's so elementary. Studying different situations that happens in society because why and I don't want to go down the sports conversation because we got to wrap it up, but yeah, the reason why for a while, a long time, you've seen predominantly white and then you started seeing sprinkles of black people, particularly in football. But at one point it was said within the NFL administration and the NFL team owners, they thought that a black person was not educated enough to be a quarterback. But that's not true. It was discriminatory practices, particularly in the private entity, that prohibited black men for being in baseball, basketball, and football. However, when they started realizing we could make money because they are very talented, so you bring in the talent, which was, we look at the leagues now, basketball, football is predominantly black, right? Basically, and so much money is coming in. So when it comes to money, all that discriminatory racist stuff kind of goes out the window. Even though
Well,
you were practicing it for so long from since the beginning up until a certain point, but now you want to increase your bottom line. So yeah, let's let them in because they're talented and they're going to bring us more money and we're going to sell more tickets and we're going to have more marketing and advertisement.
we're not talking about sports directly,
No, we're
about
not.
education.
We're just talking about the whole DEI with the grant.
Yeah, but my point is even back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, when segregation was ironclad legal under American law, you had all of these black folk at Harvard, Yale, Princeton who got in through the front door. They did not have affirmative action. They made it. Got in UCLA, Berkeley, Stanford, you name it. I was talking about with the sports metaphor is where there was no affirmative action, they made it. You can talk about black folk can't operate fast, complex machinery, but then the 332nd for 1944 and 45 were the leading scorers in the whole Army Air Force in Europe for the last 9 months of the war. So what put that?
So basically, so let me just bring it back to the topic. So basically, cutting the millions of dollars to these grants for these gender studies or whatever. Basically, the Trump administration is basically saying we don't need that. That is wasting money. And to the point that you were making, the times it was a blacks being admitted into Harvard or whatever. A high number is probably higher now, but for during that time, where there was no 1965 Civil Rights Act, there was no affirmative, there was none of that, but there were black people going into these. Well, it's not a whole lot, but for that time, you could say it was a good portion, but it wasn't a lot of enrollment in Harvard of black people.
Okay, well, let me say
you
this.
Kind of count it on one hand, but I get the sentiment that you're making. But how I look at it like this, the Trump administration is basically trying to go back to a time to where you got in on merit, and an institution cannot discriminate against you because of your race or gender, or sexuality. No, they cannot. But we're not going to let you come in because you're black as well. So it has to be merit based without discrimination.
Yeah, everything you say. See, from another perspective, these DEI programs they have that they are funding, I think they're propaganda programs that are subtly designed and intended to convince black students that they are failures and that they can't do as well as white folk, which is why they need the programs. See, that's one way of looking at it. I also know this. UCLA, where I'm an alumnus, double alumnus, they had more black students in the 1930s and 40s admitted to UCLA than got admitted in 2004 and 5 to UCLA. And I was working with the grad students or the alumni with their admissions program. So there were 90-some thousand students at UCLA in 2005, and they admitted one black freshman, or may have been 2004. So that was just an absolute disgrace compared to the number of black folk that were admitted to UCLA in 1935, when there was no such thing as affirmative action. You see, no such thing when you start talking about 1965, when I got in UCLA, they had not invented affirmative action. Myself,
right, and the
other students helped invent the stuff.
Right, the enrollment percentages of black enrollment was higher than it is today in PWIs,
and they didn't even have it.